we are together again today. Are you tired of going through documents? We are almost finished, I promise. Today we are going to look at the counteroffer, the inspection response, the inspection waiver, and the final walkthrough. These are all steps that you will probably incur. Whether you're on the listing side or the buyer side, you definitely will need to know how to maneuver through these documents. So jumping right in, let's look at the counteroffer to contract to purchase real estate. If you're representing the seller, you would mark seller. If you're representing the buyer, you would mark buyer. So either scenario, you're the listing agent, you've received an offer, it looks great, but there are a couple of things that the seller wants to counter to the buyer. Or as a buyer's agent, you've written an offer, you've presented it, the seller has presented you a counter, your buyer a counter, and your buyer wants to counter the terms that the seller has countered. So you can get into back and forth with counter offers. It may be an accepted offer right off the bat. It could be maybe one counter offer. You could have days of counter offers going back and forth. So obviously the goal is to help the buyer and the seller reach an agreed contract so they can achieve their goals, their dreams, and the buyer's agent and the listing agent work together to help their clients achieve their goals, right? Get to the closing table, make it happen. But always at the direction of your client. It's not about you, it is about your client and what is best for them, what they want. And you are just facilitating and helping them maneuver through to get to that place. So the counter offer to contract to purchase. Again, whichever party you're representing, mark that box. Contract dated. This is a counter offer. It's not an amendment. So the contract is dated. All terms are not agreed. There's not an effective date. This is the date the buyer wrote the contract. So that would be the date at the top of each page on the purchase contract. So that date goes here. Property address, seller's name, buyer's name. And then you come to the contract. You write the paragraph number and the line number is changed as follows. So if your party, buyer or seller, wants to counteroffer the purchase price, then you look on the purchase contract and you find that paragraph number, that line number, you identify it here. Paragraph, I think it's 5. I have the old contract in my head. It used to be line 21. You have to refer back to the purchase contract. So identify the paragraph number and the line number for the term you're changing. If it's purchase price, put purchase price to be. You can do purchase price : just mimic or mock the language and how it's laid out in the actual paragraph. Okay. Whatever the purchase price is that your party, that your client is wanting to counter. So say the purchase price of $150,000 was presented, but your client wants to counter at $148,500. So you would put purchase price to be $148,500 .00 period. That's all you need to put there. You don't mention what the other offer or purchase contract or counter offer, whatever they're countering, you don't mention that information. That's already established in that counter offer. You're making a new counter offer with new information, and you're only changing the terms that the buyer wants to change or the seller wants to change. So typically that does involve purchase price. Sometimes it might involve the home warranty. So you would put that paragraph, that line number, and what the new term is. Home warranty is waived, or home warranty is not provided by, blah, blah, blah. Sometimes it's the earnest money amount. Sometimes it's the closing date. Sometimes it's the amount of closing costs that the seller will pay for the buyer. Those are the typical things that are countered. So again, whatever the terms are that are being countered, you put the paragraph number, the line number, and then the verbiage for the new information that your client wants to present as a term for this purchase contract. Say there are only 2 items that are being countered. Come down here to number 3, put n/A, 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 or x's, 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 dashes, 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 so that we know that, okay, there were 2 terms being countered and no other terms, right? You don't have to do that on all of these blanks, but just the next one under whatever the last one was that you filled in, so that it's understood that those are the only terms being requested. Come down here to number 7. The following addenda are rejected. Say the buyer presented a repair addenda and the seller does not want to agree to that. They can reject it here, and so you would just identify it. Addendum, repair addendum rejected. It says rejected here. Just put repair addendum here. A new addendum could be substituted. So say there were multiple things requested on that repair addendum, or the personal property addendum, E, whichever one, the seller could choose, or if the buyer and seller have gone back and forth, the buyer could reject whatever addendum. So identify the addendum here, and then you would have to complete a new addendum if your client is presenting a new addendum. So say the personal property addendum was rejected because there were all kinds of things listed. So maybe this seller is presenting a new personal property addendum with the items that the seller is willing to include in the purchase contract. And then, of course, if that's part of this counteroffer, that new personal property addendum would need to be obviously completed and signed and included when this is sent over for the opposing party's signatures. Okay, expiration. This counteroffer must be accepted by offeree before blank time on blank day, and then you identify whichever party you're representing to write the counteroffer for. Check whichever box is applicable, have them sign and date it, and then you would submit this to the other agent, again, including any additional addendum if applicable. So your response time, just like on counteroffers, you can do a quicker turnaround time. You do want to be respectful, obviously, of the listing agent's time or the buyer's agent's time. Put the shoe on the other foot and put yourself in their position and be respectful and mindful of their time as well and their ability to communicate with their client. But usually on counteroffers, you can make it a little tighter of a window on that response time because you're only countering a couple of terms. And generally by this point, both parties kind of know the window of leniency they may have on whatever terms they're countering. So it's pretty quick back and forth usually. If you're receiving the counteroffer, then obviously you review those terms, whatever's countered with your client, and then you would mark that they accept, they reject, and counter, or they reject completely, like it's a dead deal. So they have the opportunity, again, to accept the counteroffer. They accept all the new terms. The terms in the counteroffer would supersede whatever was written in the purchase contract or whatever was written in a previous counteroffer that was recountered. But accept means these terms stand. You're now under contract. Earnest money is deposited, title work is ordered, contract submitted to the lender, and you move forward with inspections. If you reject the counteroffer and make new counteroffer, then you would have your client sign and you would prepare a new counteroffer according to whatever those terms would be. And you would submit both documents, the rejected and making a new counter, this document, and then the new counteroffer that you prepare for your client. You send both of those over to the other agent. Or if they reject the counteroffer, then again, it's just a dead deal. You don't move forward with anything, but you do need to provide your client's response to the other agent. So your client would then, of course, you would identify them as buyer or seller, they would sign and date, and you would share this document with the other agent. Final walkthrough. So you have had your purchase contract accepted, counteroffer accepted, you're under contract, you've gone through the process of inspections and appraisal and government inspection and title commitment review, and now you're to, a day or two before closing. Repairs have been made, everybody's excited. You, as the buyer's agent, need to schedule a final walkthrough for your buyer to go through the house. In that, you do have the opportunity, or you can, or you should inform your buyer that they do have the opportunity to have their inspector, their home inspector, come back through the house. That would need to be a scheduled appointment in advance for the inspector to review the repairs that were performed on the property, to make sure that they are completed in a workmanlike manner and they did remedy whatever the defect was. The final walkthrough usually at this point is between the agent and the buyer. Usually that re-inspection is done prior to the final walkthrough. Sometimes it is performed at the final walkthrough. I don't recommend having that re-inspection with the inspector on the final walkthrough. This appointment, the final walkthrough, should usually be a pretty quick appointment. You're meeting, you're just going through the property, making sure all of the seller's items are removed that were agreed upon to be removed, and that all of the items that are supposed to stay at the property are indeed at the property. This can get a little tight as far as like the moving schedule. Sometimes sellers have the moving vans in the driveway on the day of closing, and they're loading them up literally on their way to the title company. So a lot of communication needs to take place between the list agent, the buyer's agent, to determine the timing for that final walkthrough, to ensure that both parties are protected, that the personal property that is supposed to leave is gone and the personal property that's supposed to stay is there and secure. The other thing is that the property is left in a clean, orderly, broom-swept fashion. I actually did a final walkthrough one time, and the seller had forgotten and left the basement sliding door wide open, and we had had a rainstorm, and leaves and brush and water had all come into the basement, and that's what we found on our final walkthrough. So final walkthroughs are super important, and don't neglect to provide that service to your buyer. The buyer has the opportunity, obviously, to accept the property in the present condition, or if there are discrepancies or repairs that have not been completed, then you write in what those are and what the remedy may be. Recently, I've had calls from some agents about, I went in to do the final walkthrough and the central air unit isn't working correctly. What do I do? Well, this is why you don't want to wait till the last minute for the final walkthrough if you can avoid it, because something big like that, the central air unit not working, the buyers had an inspection, it was in good working order, now you're at the final walkthrough and it's not. How do you remedy that at the final walkthrough 15 minutes before closing? Ideally, you do the final walkthrough at least the day before, if possible. That would allow time for a contractor to come in, licensed HVAC specialist to come in and assess the situation, provide an estimate. The title company can save out money in escrow, or the seller can pay the contractor, at closing, prior to closing, so that bill is paid in full. So then the buyer can have that repair performed, not at their cost, but at the seller's cost, and it's already paid for. If you're doing it 15 minutes prior to closing and that's discovered, you can certainly do and require the seller to pay for that repair. But if the closing documents are all signed, the transaction's closed, everybody has left the title company, funds have been transferred, and that repair is still looming, who's to say the seller would come back and pay that bill? There's no guarantee for that. And so you want to make sure that you've got any discrepancies either held in escrow for whatever the repair may entail, or the buyer and seller reach an agreement prior to signing those closing documents. There have been situations where a closing has had to be delayed for whatever reason because something was not at the satisfaction of the buyer. And that can be traumatic for everybody. Everybody's got moving companies and emotional investment and slave labor and loading up the house, right? Just ultimate emotional investment, physical investment, time, exhaustion. You get to that closing table and everybody just can't wait for the transaction to be done and over, and then there's an issue to cause more of a dilemma. So again, you want to make sure that you get this final walkthrough scheduled in ample time to find a remedy, agree on the remedy, make sure that money is held in escrow or provided for that remedy prior to the signing of any of the documents. Buyer and seller, obviously buyer would present their case, seller can respond if there are discrepancies, and you help negotiate through whatever remedy if there are issues there with the final walkthrough. Long discussion, but it's a super important part of representing your client. So before you get to the final walkthrough, we do have the inspection responses. So you would do one inspection response for each type of inspection. So there's the property inspection, environmental, that would be like radon or mold, if your client has those inspections. The wood infestation, that would be your termite inspection, sewer or septic. Title, that would be obviously the title commitment. The well inspection, if there's a well, a survey, if the buyer wants a survey, and then the governmental occupancy. So these are the different types of inspections the buyer can have. They may not have any of them, they may have all of them. But for the inspection response, you need to include one inspection per inspection response. So contract dated, this would be the effective date. Property, seller, buyer, okay, come down, and you have, you would mark whichever inspection it is. The buyer has the opportunity to state that they performed the inspection and they are satisfied with the inspection and the report, and they're not seeking any repairs or monetary adjustments. Mark that box, buyer signs here, and you as the buyer's agent would present this inspection response to the listing agent. The listing agent would then present it to their client. If that top box is marked by the buyer, it says the contingency is resolved. Now, it does provide a part for the seller to acknowledge that the buyer is not seeking any repairs or monetary adjustments. The seller could mark this option D and sign. That's a completely disclosed, fully agreed upon inspection response. Because the language is here, the contingency is resolved. On that situation, the option D and seller signature is not required. However, communication of that information with the seller is 100% advised, and the seller can have the opportunity to sign that if the listing agent needs that for their file. It's totally fine. If the buyer is seeking repairs, then the buyer would mark this, or you would mark this box as representative of the buyer. Buyer requests satisfaction of the following requirements and or a monetary supplement as specified below. Complete copy of the inspection report is provided. If the buyer is requesting any repairs or any monetary supplement or settlement, then it is your responsibility to share that full inspection report with the listing agent. The seller has the right to review that full report. Some agents share the summary page. Some agents only share the pages that pertain to the repairs that the buyer is asking for, but the inspection response states that a complete copy is provided. So it is your responsibility to send that full report. Okay, so the buyer marks this, then in this box is identified the repairs the buyer is requesting. If this box isn't sufficient, then you may need to put in the language C attached and provide just a blank page of paper. You should include this information up here: the contract date, property address, the sellers and the buyers. Note what kind of inspection response is it, and then identify this is the attachment to the inspection response, and then you can itemize those items, and then you would add in a signature place for buyers and sellers on the attachment as well. That just confirms that buyer and seller have both seen that attachment. They acknowledge they have received that attachment. So buyer identifies the repairs they are wanting. If it's a roof repair, you definitely want to include the language licensed roofer to evaluate and repair roof according to whatever page or whatever paragraph or item number, however the inspection report identifies the discrepancy or the defect. So you itemize your repairs that the buyer is requesting. Buyer would sign. Then the seller has the opportunity to respond. The seller can satisfy whatever the buyer is asking. The contingency is resolved. The seller can propose to satisfy the buyer in a different manner and identify. Maybe they're willing to do 4 out of 5 of the repairs. Those need to be identified here. And or one of those boxes can be checked, don't have to be, but can be. Then the seller would agree to make a monetary contribution toward the cost of repairs in the form of you identify the dollar amount, and the seller or listing agent would need to mark one of these 2 boxes, credit at closing in lieu of making repairs, or toward the closing costs, see amendment. If the seller is doing a monetary adjustment in lieu of repairs or in addition to repairs. Option C is seller declines to satisfy buyer's request. That box would be marked if the seller is doing no repairs. Or option D, as we discussed, seller acknowledges buyer's not seeking any repairs. So in this case, where the buyer is requesting repairs, the seller would mark option A, option B, or option C, and then sign. If the seller counters the repairs that the buyer has requested, then the buyer has the option to now counter and respond. Buyer can accept the seller's proposal. The buyer can accept the seller's proposal under option C, where there are no repairs made, or the buyer can counter the seller's proposal and then make a new proposal and identify whatever they want to renegotiate on those repairs. The option 4 is that the buyer declines the seller's option above and terminates, and so then a termination notice would be presented at that point. And if obviously no agreement is made between buyer and seller, buyer does have that right in the contract to terminate at that point. So the earnest money legally should be returned in most situations. Buyer would sign. In the event that the buyer chooses to counter, then there is an inspection response continued. So this picks up with the seller then, seller's response to the buyer's counter proposal, and then the seller has the option to satisfy the buyer in the following manner, or accept or decline. So, and then the buyer has the opportunity to respond again, accept, reject, terminate. And so it could go on and on and on. Usually it's all completed in that first 1-page document. The property inspection is the one that typically goes back and forth a couple of times maybe. The other inspections are generally just a one-time back and forth, because in the event of the wood infestation, if termite treatment is needed, a lot of times that's required for the loan to be approved anyway. Environmental, radon, or mold. The radon, generally the seller would be responsible to remedy that. The mold, that may go back and forth and no agreement made and terminated, or the seller may agree to remedy it. Sewer and septic, that may go back and forth a couple of times depending on what the report states. Usually, there can be some marks or blemishes or spots on the title, so that would be, but in general, the title is usually okay, and so that's not an issue. Obviously, well survey, depending on the property, and then the governmental occupancy is can go back and forth on this form if the seller isn't going to perform the repairs required for occupancy. Okay, that's the inspection response, and the inspection response continued. Last one we're going to talk about today is the inspection waiver. So you have the contract dated, the property address, by the seller and the buyer, and you can mark as many as you want on this. This can be just a one form. Where the inspection response, you just could only mark the one box to deal with that one inspection. This is an inspection waiver, so you can mark as many as apply. So say the buyer had a property inspection, they had a termite inspection, there was a government inspection, and they had an appraisal. But they didn't have a radon, they didn't have a survey, they didn't have a sewer, and there's no well. So you would mark environmental, survey, sewer, well, and then buyers and sellers would sign that the buyer did not have those inspections. They're waiving those inspections. So this is a good form to have just because it proves that you had a conversation with your buyer about the inspections they could have, and it verifies with the buyer's signature that they chose not to have those inspections. They waived those inspections. So definitely include the inspection waiver in the forms that you utilize as you're moving through the transaction. That is it for today. You know who to reach out to if you have questions. Make today great.